The alien dragon descended from the clouds, like a storm given form. Its scales shimmered in hues of black and crimson, each plate as thick as starship armor. Wings as wide as a city unfurled with an ear-piercing crack, casting a shadow over the barren outpost below. This creature was not a myth. It was a terror carved into the histories of 100 civilizations. Wherever it went, death followed. On the outskirts of the galaxy, the remote medical outpost of Aegis 7 trembled under the weight of its roar. The dragon's eyes, glowing like twin suns, swept over the settlement, seeking signs of resistance. It found none. The facility was designed for healing, not combat. The staff and patients inside were defenseless against the nightmare that now loomed overhead. Dr. Elias Corwin, the outpost's chief medic, stood alone in the central courtyard, his white coat billowing in the wind stirred by the creature's arrival. At first glance, he was an unremarkable figure, tall but lean, his face lined with exhaustion from years of tending to the wounded in war zones. Yet there was something in his eyes that set him apart, an unwavering resolve. Elias had seen horrors before, the kind that shattered minds and broke spirits. He had stitched soldiers back together on blood-soaked battlefields, worked tirelessly through plagues that decimated colonies, and held the hands of the dying as they took their final breaths. Fear was an old companion, one he had long since learned to master. The dragon landed with an earth-shaking thud, its talons carving furrows into the rocky ground. Its serpentine neck craned down, bringing its enormous head level with Elias. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of the humans standing defiantly in its shadow. The outpost's alarms wailed, urging evacuation, but Elias made no move to flee. Behind him, he knew, were the injured and the weak, those who couldn't run even if they tried. To leave them would be to betray everything he stood for. The dragon let out a guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through the bones. It expected screams, panic, perhaps even an armed response. Instead, Elias simply stepped forward, his posture steady, his gaze unflinching. "You're hurt," he said, his voice calm yet firm. The dragon's growl faltered, replaced by a low rumble of confusion. It had expected prey, not a confrontation, and certainly not an observation about its state. Elias's eyes flicked to the creature's left flank, where a jagged scar marred the otherwise impenetrable scales. Dark ichor seeped from the wound, staining the ground beneath it. He took another step forward, careful but deliberate. "Whatever brought you here," Elias continued, "you won't survive long with that injury untreated." For a moment, the dragon hesitated. Its instinct screamed at it to attack, to crush this insolent creature underfoot. Yet, something about Elias's demeanor gave it pause. There was no fear in this human, only a strange certainty that unsettled the predator. Behind Elias, the distant sound of fleeing vehicles faded into silence. The outpost was deserted save for him and the patients within. He knew the odds of survival were slim, but he also knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this creature take any more lives today. The dragon bared its teeth, a hiss escaping its throat. It loomed closer, its massive head mere feet from Elias. The medic held his ground, his heartbeat steady. "Decide quickly," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Do you want to keep fighting, or do you want to live?" The creature's eyes narrowed, twin suns flickering with uncertainty. For the first time, the galaxy's deadliest predator found itself at a crossroads, faced with a choice it had never considered before. The standoff hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The dragon's glowing eyes locked onto Elias, narrowing with predatory intent. It lowered its massive head until its jaws were level with him, each tooth glinting like a blade. One snap, and the human would be gone. But instead of cowering or fleeing, Elias took another deliberate step forward, his expression calm. "I've seen worse wounds," Elias said, gesturing toward the deep gash across the dragon's side. "You're bleeding internally. If that infection spreads, even you won't survive. Let me help you, the dragon hissed, the sound reverberating through the empty outpost. Help? This was no offer it had ever encountered. It had come expecting resistance, fire, and bloodshed, not this strange calmness. Yet the human's steady tone and the sharp glint of understanding in his eyes stirred something the dragon couldn't place, a feeling that made its claws dig into the earth for stability. The medic's words weren't idle. He had noticed the subtle shifts in the dragon's movement, the way it slightly favored one side. He'd treated countless soldiers with similar injuries. Beneath the scales and fury, this creature wasn't invincible. It was wounded, vulnerable. The dragon's nostrils flared as it assessed the man before it. Fearless. No, not fearless. There was something deeper, calculated confidence. This human wasn't reckless. He knew what he was doing. That realization unsettled the dragon more than any weapon ever had. The medic bent down, retrieving a small medical scanner from his satchel. He held it up, making sure the dragon could see it. "I'm going to scan the wound," he said. "You can crush me if you like, but that won't stop the pain you're in." The dragon growled low in its throat, a sound that promised death. But it didn't move to attack. Instead, it watched as Elias knelt and activated the scanner. A soft hum filled the tense silence, the blue light sweeping across the jagged wound. Elias furrowed his brow as the readings came through. The injury was severe, likely caused by an explosive projectile. Shrapnel was embedded deep in the tissue, and infection was already spreading. Without intervention, the dragon wouldn't last more than a few days. "You've been through a battle recently," Elias said, glancing up at the creature. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. You're lucky to have survived." The dragon rumbled, its massive tail curling defensively behind it. It wasn't used to this, being studied, being spoken to as though it were something other than a force of destruction. The idea of letting this human get closer felt absurd, yet the pain gnawing at its side was a reminder of its own mortality. Elias stood, meeting the dragon's gaze. "You're not invincible," he said plainly. "But you don't have to die here either. Let me work, and you might live to fight another day." The dragon's eyes narrowed, its instincts warring with something deeper, a flicker of hesitation, of doubt. For the first time in its long, brutal existence, it felt an unfamiliar sensation crawling beneath its scales. It wasn't anger or hunger or even pain. It was fear. The realization struck the dragon like a blow. This tiny creature, so fragile in comparison, held a power it couldn't comprehend. Not the strength to destroy, but the ability to see through its defenses, to expose its weaknesses. That clarity was more terrifying than any weapon. The dragon lowered itself slightly, its massive frame settling onto the ground. It did not speak, but its silence was an answer. Elias nodded, stepping closer with practiced ease. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "This won't be easy, but you'll get through it." The dragon's gaze followed his every move, wary yet strangely trusting. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. No longer predator and prey, they were something else entirely. Two beings caught in an unexpected alliance. And as Elias began his work, the dragon, for the first time, wondered if survival might mean more than conquest. The dragon lay motionless, its massive frame casting a shadow over the courtyard. Its breathing was labored, its glowing eyes half-lidded, but fixed on Elias as he worked. The human medic moved with careful precision, wielding tools meant for much smaller patients. He wiped sweat from his brow as he extracted the final shard of jagged metal embedded deep in the dragon's side. "Got it," Elias murmured, holding up the shard before discarding it into a sterilization container. He glanced up at the dragon. "You'll still need time to heal, but the infection won't spread anymore." The dragon's gaze narrowed as it studied him. It had expected pain, perhaps death, but not this. This calm efficiency, this relentless determination to save a creature that had come to destroy. The sensation of fear lingered, but it was no longer alone. In its place, a strange curiosity began to take root. "You're not like the others," the dragon rumbled at last, its voice a deep vibration that made the air tremble. Elias paused, surprised by the words. The dragon's speech was guttural, its meaning clear despite the alien tongue. He straightened, meeting its gaze. "I'm a medic. My job is to save lives, not take them. Even yours." The dragon tilted its massive head, its thoughts unreadable. It had always viewed humans as fragile, insignificant things, scurrying across the galaxy like ants. Yet this one stood unbroken, unfazed even in the face of overwhelming power. "What do you gain?" the dragon asked. "Saving me?" Elias sighed, setting his tools aside. "Not everything is about gain," he replied. "Sometimes it's about doing what's right, even if it's hard." The dragon's chest rumbled, not with a growl, but with a sound closer to thoughtfulness. "You speak of strength, yet you have none. No claws, no fangs, no fire." Elias allowed himself a small smile. "Strength isn't just about what you can destroy. It's also about what you can protect." The dragon fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on it. For millennia, it had been a destroyer, feared and unstoppable. It had never considered that strength might mean something else entirely. Minutes passed as Elias cleaned the wound and applied an adhesive sealant. The dragon watched him intently, its glowing eyes flickering with emotions it didn't fully understand. "You could have run," the dragon said after a while. "You could have let me die." "I could have," Elias agreed, stepping back to survey his work. "But then what kind of person would I be?" The dragon didn't respond, its gaze shifting toward the horizon. It had come to the outpost as a predator, seeking dominance over creatures it deemed inferior. Now it was leaving as something else, changed, though it couldn't yet name the change. The pain in its side had dulled, replaced by a strange lightness. It flexed its wings experimentally, the air rippling with their movement. Elias stepped back, giving the creature space. "You'll be fine," he said, his tone almost casual. "Just try not to get into any more fights for a while." The dragon huffed, a plume of hot air washing over him. "You're bold for someone so small." "And you're alive because of someone so small," Elias countered with a smirk. The dragon paused, then let out a low rumble that could almost be mistaken for laughter. Without another word, it spread its wings, the force of their motion kicking up dust and debris. It rose into the air, its shadow shrinking as it ascended. Elias watched it go, his heart finally beginning to slow. He didn't know if he'd ever see the creature again, but something told him this wasn't the end. For better or worse, their paths had crossed, and neither would forget. As the dragon disappeared into the clouds, Elias turned back toward the outpost, his mind already on the patients waiting inside. There was still work to be done, but a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. The galaxy was vast and filled with dangers, but today one of those dangers had learned something new. And perhaps so had he.